In Texas, a massive battle is raging over exactly what 5.5 million students learn about history, religion, and the very foundation of America.
It's a huge shift, and it's happening right now.
It really is. Welcome to our deep dive. I'm your host, and my mission today is to help you unpack this giant stack of bills, press releases, and articles we've got sitting right here.
And I am your resident expert. I'm really glad to be diving into this one with you.
Yeah, so right now, the Texas State Board of Education, the SBOE, is completely overhauling K through 12 social studies.
Right. They are rewriting the K through 12 reading lists and social studies standards, and it's making national headlines.
Exactly. So let's start with a quick 90-second news summary of where things stand. The SBOE is bringing two major new laws into the spotlight. First up, you've got Senate Bill 11.
Which is the one that allows schools to set up voluntary prayer periods during the school day.
Right. And then second, you have House Bill 1605. This one brings biblical texts directly into the required K through 12 curriculum.
We're talking about things like the Book of Job, the parable of the Prodigal Son, the Psalms.
Yeah, and they're integrated right alongside traditional books. Now, supporters argue these changes are totally necessary. They say these texts build vital reading skills and, teach the foundational American values that shape the country.
But critics are pushing back hard. They argue the state is tearing down the wall between church and state, basically to push Christian nationalism on a very diverse student body.
And the timeline here is tight. The board expects to hold final votes on these changes in June 2026. And because Texas buys so many textbooks, whatever they decide is going to dictate what publishers print for the entire nation.
Which is why the whole country is watching this play out.
Okay, let's unpack this. We need to start with the actual legal mechanics, right? Because, dropping prayer in the Bible into public schools immediately sounds like a massive lawsuit waiting to happen.
Oh, absolutely.
So how do these bills actually work in a practical day-to-day classroom?
Well, that's the crucial question. Because the lawmakers who drafted these bills weren't just, throwing ideas at a wall, Senate Bill 11 creates a very specific legal framework.
Just for school prayer.
Yeah, it allows school districts to designate periods for prayer and reading religious texts, but it comes with heavy, explicit guardrails.
Right, because when you just say prayer in public school, the immediate image is like a teacher standing at the front of a room forcing 30 kids to bow their heads.
Exactly. But looking at the text of Senate Bill 11, it's designed to prevent exactly that scenario.
Okay, so what are the guardrails?
First off, participation is strictly voluntary. But it goes further than a kid just raising their hand. A student needs a physically signed consent form from a parent or guardian.
Oh, interesting.
And the exact same rule applies to school employees, actually. But the second rule is where the logistics get really complicated.
How so?
The law states that this prayer or reading period cannot take place within the physical presence or even the hearing distance of anyone who hasn't submitted that signed consent form.
Wait, really? I'm struggling to see how a school practically enforces that out of earshot in a crowded middle school. They can't just use the morning intercom system then, right?
Correct. The law specifically bans using a public address system for this. Schools literally have to figure out how to isolate these students.
Wow.
Yeah, they might have to hold these periods before normal school hours or designate very specific empty classrooms at the far end of a hallway.
That sounds like a lot of work.
And it cannot replace regular instructional time. You can't just pause algebra for 20 minutes of prayer.
Which puts a huge logistical burden on the administration. But if a school jumps through all those hoops, they get a massive reward from the state, right? Looking at this provision about the Attorney General.
Yes, the state provides an ultimate legal shield.
Really?
Yeah. If a school district adopts this policy and gets sued by an angry parent or a civil rights group, the Texas Attorney General is required by law to defend that school district in court. The state assumes the legal risk.
Wow. So that's the prayer side. But let's look at House Bill 1605, because this one operates completely differently.
It does. It requires the Texas Education Agency to create and recommend required reading lists for all grade levels.
Right, and they've drafted a list of about 300 literary works. You have the classics, your Dr. Seuss, standard elementary books, but they've interwoven biblical stories directly into the required curriculum.
And it spans the entire K through 12 spectrum. For kindergarten, the state is proposing the Golden Rule.
Okay.
In first grade, students would read the parable of the Prodigal Son. By seventh grade, they're studying the Psalms, and by the time they are high school seniors, they're assigned the Book of Job.
This reminds me of like a digital terms of service agreement, but for classroom religion.
How do you mean?
Think about the difference between these two laws. Senate Bill 11 is an opt-in system. You have to actively sign a piece of paper saying, yes, my kid will participate in the prayer period.
Right.
But the reading list under House Bill 1605 is an opt-out system. The biblical texts are baked right into the everyday curriculum.
They are.
Now, yes, parents are legally allowed to opt their kids out of specific readings if it conflicts with their personal beliefs. But that puts the entire burden on the parent to meticulously read the syllabus, catch the specific assignment, and pull their kid out for that specific hour.
It's a lot of oversight for a parent.
Doesn't an opt-out system create a total nightmare for teachers who have to manage who stays in the room, and an incredibly isolating environment for non-Christian students who get sent to the library?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we can see exactly why lawmakers are relying on these opt-in and opt-out mechanisms. They're intentionally testing the boundaries of recent Supreme Court shifts.
Okay, unpack that for me.
So for decades, courts used something called the Lemon Test to determine if a school violated the separation of church and state. Under the Lemon Test, any government action had to have a strictly secular purpose.
Meaning, if a law looked like it was endorsing religion, courts would strike it down immediately.
Exactly. But recently, in a landmark case called Kennedy v. Bremerton School District, the Supreme Court essentially abandoned the Lemon Test.
Oh, that was the case involving the high school football coach, right? The one praying on the 50-yard line.
That's the one. The court ruled in his favor and basically said we should now look at historical practices and understandings when judging religious expression.
I see.
Texas lawmakers are building this new legal architecture, these opt-ins and opt-outs, to see exactly how far they can push religious integration under this new, much friendlier Supreme Court standard without technically violating the First Amendment.
Okay, so Senate Bill 11 and House Bill 1605 build the legal doorways to get these texts into the building. But what actually walks through those doors? Why does the state want these specific religious texts in the classroom? How do they fit into the massive overhaul of the social studies curriculum?
Well, the proposed social studies changes represent a major ideological shift. The new drafts heavily emphasize Western civilization, Texas history, and the concept of American exceptionalism.
And to make room for that, they had to cut other things out.
Right. The drafts de-emphasize world history, global geography, and the deep study of non-Western cultures.
And the supporters of this shift are not hiding their intentions. State Board of Education member Brandon Hall argues you simply cannot have a complete education without understanding these foundational texts.
Yeah, he specifically points to the 23rd Psalm, calling it one of the greatest poems in history.
He argues that since these concepts shaped American culture and law, leaving them out leaves students with a massive historical blind spot.
That's the core cultural argument, yeah. But there's also an academic argument driving the pro side. Another board member, Tiffany Clark, highlighted a really stark statistic.
What was it?
She pointed out that Texas currently ranks 44th in the nation for third-grade reading. Supporters argue that creating a shared cultural literacy is the best way to fix that abysmal ranking.
Wait, I need you to break that down for me. How does reading the 23rd Psalm or the Book of Job magically fix a third grader's reading comprehension scores? That feels like a huge leap in logic.
Well, let's look at the cognitive science behind their argument. Modern reading science shows that reading comprehension isn't just about sounding out letters.
Right.
It's heavily dependent on background knowledge. If you read a paragraph about a baseball game, but you don't know what an inning or a strike is, you won't understand the text, even if you can physically read the words.
Oh, okay.
Advocates for the new curriculum argue that American literature, political speeches, and historical documents are absolutely saturated with biblical references.
Ah, I see. So if a high schooler reads Martin Luther King Jr. or Abraham Lincoln, and they don't know the biblical stories those leaders are referencing, they miss the deeper meaning of the text.
Exactly. The pro side argues that by teaching these specific stories early on, they are giving every student, regardless of their background, the same foundational vocabulary. They believe rigorous, shared cultural knowledge improves reading comprehension across the board.
But the critics look at this curriculum and see something entirely different. Groups like Asian Texans for Justice are raising massive red flags about historical erasure.
They absolutely are.
They point out that in the rush to emphasize Texas and American exceptionalism, the draft curriculum actually removed references to Japanese-American internment camps during World War II.
That's a perfect example of the opposition's concern. Critics argue that by focusing so intensely on a single, triumphant Western narrative, the curriculum actively glosses over the complex and often dark parts of United States history.
Yeah, and at the state hearings, testifiers also pointed out deep flaws in how the civil rights movement and the New Deal are covered.
Furthermore, educators are arguing that these new standards replace actual critical thinking with rote memorization. They say students are just being asked to memorize a laundry list of historical facts that fit a specific political narrative.
Here's where it gets really interesting. When you dig into the fine print of the draft reading list, there is this fascinating, almost bizarre quirk.
Oh, the author listing.
Yes. For texts like The Golden Rule and The Road to Damascus, the curriculum list literally states that the author is the state of Texas.
Yeah, that specific detail caught a lot of attention during the review process.
Because these stories aren't taken verbatim from the King James Bible or the Torah, they are adapted versions. The state has actively edited them for a public school classroom.
Right.
So what happens when a state government literally rewrites a sacred text to fit a curriculum? I mean, changing a few words in a textbook is one thing, but editing scripture.
That question strikes right at the heart of the controversy, and it makes people on both sides nervous. When the government edits a religious story to make it palatable for a classroom, it ceases to be a sacred text.
It becomes a state-sponsored document.
Exactly. Strict secularists hate it because it's still religion in the classroom. But devout religious parents hate it too, because they don't want a government committee watering down or altering the Word of God. It blurs the line between education and religious endorsement in a way that creates huge theological headaches.
Which brings us to the next vital piece of this puzzle. Now that we know what the curriculum is and why it's so contentious, we have to look at who is actually writing it and who is fighting to stop it.
Right, the architects of the curriculum.
The State Board of Education relies on a panel of content advisors to guide these changes, and the people they picked have sparked an absolute firestorm.
The advisors have become the ultimate lightning rods. Let's look at David Barton. He was appointed as an expert content advisor. Barton is a very well-known Christian activist who openly argues that the separation of church and state is a total myth.
And critics have been shouting from the rooftops that Barton has absolutely no formal historical training.
Right.
In fact, a book he wrote a decade ago called The Jefferson Lies was pulled from the shelves by its own Christian publisher because the historical claims were deemed totally unsupported. Yet, he is sitting in a room advising the board on what goes into millions of history books.
Then you have Donald Frazier, another lead advisor and a recognized Texas historian. Frazier recently became the center of a major political clash.
What happened there?
It was revealed that a university center he runs received a $70,000 grant from the Texas Public Policy Foundation.
And for context, the Texas Public Policy Foundation is a highly influential, very conservative think tank based in Austin.
Yeah. And when that grant came to light, all 5 Democrats on the State Board of Education demanded an immediate, independent investigation.
They argued that you can't accept $70,000 from a political think tank while simultaneously writing public school standards. They called it a massive conflict of interest.
But the Republicans on the board pushed back immediately. Board member Tom Maynard dismissed the call for an investigation entirely. He called it a smear tactic, designed solely to delay the curriculum process and play political games.
Did Frazier say anything about it?
Frazier himself defended the grant. He said his team was simply hired to discuss Texas ideas and pointed out that he doesn't have total control over the board's final decisions anyway. He only advises.
It's just a messy, highly charged political environment. But the opposition organizing against these advisors, against Senate Bill 11, and against the reading list is absolutely fascinating.
It really is.
They formed a coalition called Teach the Truth. Hundreds of people have traveled from all over Texas to rally outside these board meetings in Austin, and the atmosphere is incredibly tense.
It's gotten very heated. Representatives from KAIR, the Council on American-Islamic Relations, have faced intense hostility. Shama Zayan, an American Muslim civil rights advocate, testified at the hearings and told the board she had received death threats just for showing up to previous meetings.
The polarization at these hearings is palpable. But the actual makeup of the Teach the Truth coalition is perhaps the most revealing part of this entire story. It completely shatters the typical political binaries we expect.
Yeah, the demographics of the opposition are really telling.
Exactly. The most surprising detail is that it isn't just atheists, secularists, or civil liberties groups fighting to keep the Bible out of schools. You have Jewish rabbis, Baptist pastors, and Islamic civil rights advocates standing shoulder to shoulder at these microphones. Why are devout religious leaders fighting so hard to keep religion out of the classroom?
This raises an important question about the role of faith in public life. If we synthesize the arguments from these diverse religious leaders, their core belief becomes very clear. Teaching sacred texts and interpreting scripture is the sacred job of the family and the faith community. It is definitively not the job of the government.
They believe the state is wildly overstepping its boundaries. A fourth-grade public school teacher shouldn't be a Sunday school teacher.
Precisely. To the opposition, a public school represents the entire public. When the government elevates one specific religious tradition, in this case, Protestant Christianity, it inherently sends a message to millions of diverse Texas kids that their families, their traditions, and their beliefs are secondary.
Yeah.
A Jewish rabbi or a Baptist pastor might have vastly different theologies, but they fundamentally agree on one thing. They do not want a state employee interpreting the Bible for their children.
So what does this all mean? When you pull back and look at the whole picture, we are watching Texas fundamentally reshape its education system for 5.5 million students.
It's huge.
It's a massive, high-stakes ideological clash. On one side, you have leaders fighting to cement traditional Christian and Western foundations in public schools, arguing it builds cultural literacy, fixes reading scores, and honors American history.
Right.
On the other side, you have a fierce, religiously diverse coalition fighting to defend a secular, multicultural classroom, arguing these new standards erase minority history and violate the Constitution.
And we must remind you, the listener, why this matters so much, even if you don't live anywhere near Texas.
Right, the ripple effect.
Because of its sheer size, Texas is one of the largest single buyers of textbooks in the country. The standards the Texas State Board of Education chooses often dictate the baseline content for textbooks published and sold to schools across the rest of the United States. A curriculum change in Austin eventually ripples outward to classrooms nationwide.
The board is set to hold their final votes on this in June 2026. Until then, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. If these standards pass and the state of Texas becomes the official author of adapted Bible stories, picture a classroom a few years from now.
Okay.
How will a public school teacher balance grading a student's reading comprehension of a state-written text against that student's own deeply held religious beliefs? If a student's faith contradicts the state's version of a parable, do they fail the assignment? In Texas, the battle for the foundation of the classroom is really just beginning.